Would you ever join a cult? Most of us would probably say no. I'm a pretty rational person, and I sometimes joke that I would maybe join a cult if they had cute enough merch, water bottles and tote bags, stuff like that. But what if you didn't know it was a cult until it was far too late? What if the leaders of this organization that you found yourself to be a part of told you that they could cure your cancer, bring your dead loved ones back to life, and guide you to the ultimate salvation? In the 90s and 2000s, in the heart of Lagos, Nigeria, an evangelical church known as the Synagogue Church of All Nations was pulling in believers left and right. Thousands upon thousands were flocking to behold the power of a modern-day miracle worker. Some were seeking relief for ailments after modern medical treatment had failed them. Others were hoping for a guiding figure and loving community after hitting rock bottom. Most were captivated by the undeniable charisma of this mysterious and powerful faith healer, and lured in by the promise of a Christian utopia in the heart of Africa. But once ensnared, the true darkness was revealed. This is the story of TB Joshua and the Synagogue Church of All Nations. Hello lovelies, on this channel I focus on African mysteries and true crime. If that's something that you might be interested in, then consider subscribing. All of my sources will be linked in the description below. Now, let's get into this. Our story starts in the village of Agridi, Ondo State, Nigeria, where on June 12th, 1963, Temitope Balogun Joshua was born into a Yoruba family. Many aspects of his upbringing are kind of steeped in mystery, as most of the information we have on his childhood has been provided by him. Joshua claims that he was in his mother's womb for 15 months, which by the way is the same gestation period as a baby rhino, and apparently his birth was prophesized for an entire century before he was born. So take that with a grain of salt, but I'm going to tell you what we definitely know for sure. His father, who was a Christian, died when he was young, which left him to be raised by his Muslim uncle. TB Joshua's upbringing was difficult. His family was poverty-stricken, but he was still able to attend St. Stephen's Anglican Primary School, a Catholic school in his village. This is where he started to show his first inclinations towards his future career. He was known as Small Pastor because even at his young age, he would start to preach to his classmates and proclaim his love for the Bible. Again, not much is known about his upbringing before the founding of the church, but we do know that he dropped out of secondary school, which is basically high school, in order to work on a poultry farm to help support his family. But Joshua had aspirations for something greater than chickens. At some point in his adolescence, he ventured off to the big city, Lagos. Lagos is the most populous city in Nigeria, and at the time, it was home to almost 4 million people. Like most big cities, there are loads of opportunities, but it was also fraught with danger. Swindlers ready to scam you out of your hard-earned dollar, crooked cops, gangs, and even terrorists. Once Joshua got to Lagos, he decided to attend night classes to finish his education. According to him, he supported himself by washing people's dirty feet on the streets of the big city. Not unlike a kind of famous carpenter I know. In 1987, when Joshua was about 24 years old, his life changed forever. During a trip back home to Agridi, after an alleged 40-day and 40-night fast, he received a message from God. According to the soon-to-be prophet, he heard a voice from above proclaim, "I am your God. I am giving you a divine commission to go and carry out the work of the Heavenly Father." So that's exactly what he did. Sources differ on the exact year, but between 1987 and 1989, Joshua would go on to found the Synagogue Church of All Nations, which I will be referring to as SCOAN from here on out, in a rundown house in the Agogo Egbe neighborhood of Lagos. The area was kind of a marshy swampland, and the spot where Joshua allegedly kind of received this calling from God would be known as Prayer Mountain. Similar to his childhood, information on the very beginnings of the church are sparse at best, but we do know that Joshua started filming his sermons very early on. His propensity for filming and documenting everything would come to play a major role in the growth and operation of his church in the coming years. Through home videos featuring a humble but happy congregation led by a charming, charismatic young pastor, Joshua began to pick up steam. Early members of SCOAN were attracted to the pastor's humility and charm. Bisola Johnson, another early member who would eventually become one of Joshua's highest-ranking disciples, recounted how captivating Joshua was in the early days. "When he looked into my eyes, he pierced my subconsciousness. I wanted to cry. What started out as simple home videos would become his #1 marketing strategy. And it wasn't long before Joshua's magnetic aura and home videos started to attract more than just locals. Joshua clearly understood the value of branding and image very early on. He took the success of his essentially grassroots marketing and distribution system and poured money back into creating even more videos and VHS tapes to distribute. He would instruct the cameraman to quote-unquote record everything. Miracles, births, people convulsing, crying, screaming, everything. Joshua took inspiration from televangelist pastors from the West, such as Billy Graham, Oral Roberts, and Billy Joe Daughtry, many of whom implored evangelical rhetoric and tactics that can be traced back to the charismatic Christian movement. For clarification, the charismatic Christian movement started back in the 1950s in the United States. By the 1960s, the movement had begun to take hold in mainstream Christian denominations. The main emphasis of the movement is on the gifts of the Holy Spirit mentioned in the Bible. Followers of this movement believe that the Holy Spirit still presents these gifts to worthy followers. This includes miracles like speaking in tongues, being able to see prophecies, and healing. Joshua studied and replicated these televangelists in his sermons, oftentimes boiling down their messages into easily digestible and repeatable expressions. This, along with grandiose faith healings, created a pretty compelling story. All of this proved to be pretty successful and would go on to make him a household name in Nigeria. Now, Joshua was not the only evangelical preacher in Nigeria, not by a long shot, but his charisma, his ability to simplify and repackage spiritual concepts into palatable chunks that resonated with many audiences, and his use of documented miracles solidified his standing as a Nigerian legend. By 1996, the synagogue was growing and attracting visitors from around the world who were eager to witness these miracles firsthand, and the church was about to hit a major turning point. As SCOAN continued to grow, Joshua started to invite more well-known, usually white pastors to the church. They'd be wined and dined, shown around, and of course, they would witness these incredible faith healings firsthand. He would usually give these pastors parting gifts, oftentimes his VHS tapes of these miracles and sermons, so that they would bring them back in the busload to their congregations to disseminate and share, and the whole thing would just kind of become this cycle. So he was basically doing what he was doing before, but on a much larger scale. Through this system, the tapes began to spread exponentially. Joshua used his growing popularity abroad, specifically with white evangelicals, to market his brand, his name, and his church. You know, back in that day and age in Nigeria, having white people around kind of lended a sort of authenticity to whatever you were doing. You know, it's one thing if an African pastor is preaching to an African congregation in the middle of nowhere in a swamp. But once this African pastor has white congregants testifying and saying like, no, this is real, this is legit, well, then you've made it. And the system worked perfectly. The more people spread the tapes, the more foreigners would come, donate to him in the church, experience his awesomeness, and then go back home with a revived sense of spiritual clarity, an empty wallet, and 10 more tapes to share amongst their friends. He was pretty much going viral before that was a thing. Once the organization started to gain traction overseas, Joshua knew he had to do whatever he could to ensure that it would continue to grow and hold influence. He started paying for people's plane tickets from the US and the UK by the busload. Entire churches would be flown out to Nigeria to come and visit SCOAN for the first time. At one point, 6 out of every 10 foreign visitors coming to Nigeria were going to SCOAN. Now the money was pouring in left and right. Now, to understand why TB Joshua's, let's call it, business model was so effective, we need to kind of understand what was going on at the time. According to Boston University professor Nimi Wariboko, when Joshua had started in 1987, he focused on the spiritual and economic needs of Nigerians. The widespread poverty in the country, the precarity of life, and the brutal oppression of ordinary citizens were in sharp relief to his efforts to cater to the economic needs of the poor, his attention to the spiritual empowerment of believers, and the simplicity of his lifestyle. These contrasts endeared him to millions of Nigerians and many more all over the world. Now, let's understand what was happening abroad. By the time SCOAN was first formed, the charismatic Christian movement had already been established in the US and the UK for about 20 years. The younger generation of people who grew up going to these services were now adults in search of the same miracles that had permeated their childhoods. They had gone to church alongside their moms and dads, they'd seen people being cured by the Holy Spirit. For them, it wasn't impossible. It was part of their reality. It's pessimistic to say, but they were primed for someone like Joshua to come along and swoop them up. And where were all the miracles? In a random church in the middle of the jungle. For young evangelicals, SCOAN presented a unique opportunity to truly walk in the way of Jesus and experience the same miracles recounted in the Bible. Now, of course, there were skeptics, but Joshua knew that people would come out of sheer curiosity. And once they stepped foot onto Nigerian soil, well, that's when he knew that he had them. This was the case for many young people traveling to Nigeria to witness and meet TB Joshua. One of these young people was a woman named Rachel Holmes. Born in February 1980, Ray was your average girl next door. She grew up in a nice rural community outside of London and was raised by evangelical parents. Growing up, church was a big part of her community. She had decided very early on that she wanted to dedicate her life to God. When she was a teenager, she discovered that she was gay, which caused a lot of personal turmoil for her, given her evangelical beliefs. She was confused and lonely, but ultimately terrified that she couldn't live her life for God if she was gay. So she started to seek out some sort of quote-unquote cure. She prayed and threw herself into her church community. So at this point, Ray is part of the church youth group, and one day another teenager said that they had this tape, and it was a VHS tape from the Synagogue Church of All Nations. This tape completely changed the trajectory of her entire life. In the recordings, there were graphic videos of people with terrible injuries, women giving live births, people screaming in pain, real people with cancer and HIV, desperate to be cured. And in this video, they would be. Before and after clips of people with cancer appearing days later with their sores healed, wheelchair-bound elderly people would suddenly be able to run down the streets. Ray was essentially witnessing documented proof of real-life miracles. So then Ray started to think, hey, if this preacher can cause the blind to see, can allow the maimed to suddenly walk and be okay, then maybe he could pray my gay away. Which is so sad to think that she was put into that kind of position, but at the time she thought this was my ticket, this was my way to be closer to God. So she booked a flight to Lagos. So according to the BBC documentary, which I highly recommend that you check out on TB Joshua, Ray sort of talked about her visitor experience and what it was like. There were busloads of travelers from different countries, just there at the airport, just getting ready to be shuttled off to SCOAN. Remember, at one point, over 50% of people coming into the country were going to SCOAN, which is such a crazy statistic, so crazy to think about. Once they arrived at SCOAN, they'd be greeted by the head of visitor relations along with local members of the church who would be smiling and waving, welcoming them and essentially giving them the celebrity treatment. They'd be surrounded by all of these locals who were making them feel extremely important, almost love bombing them in a way. The visitors would remain on SCOAN property alongside whoever they were visiting with, usually other members of their congregation, their family, their friends, and they would just be super excited for the most amazing trip of their lives, essentially. The next day, visitors would be shown hours upon hours upon hours of faith healings. Then there would be hours of watching miracles being performed. Then, after days, yes, days of that, then the live testimony would begin. People would come on stage and tell all of these new recruits and visitors how they were just like them once. They were skeptical, but this church had basically changed their lives. It had healed them. They don't need to look any further. This was the true house of God. And it wasn't just stories. People were bringing up medical test results where they tested positive for HIV one day, and then the following reports showed that they were negative. Medical doctors would come up and say that they had no idea how these people were being cured, but they were. Then people who were begging to be cured would line up, you'd hear their pleas, their desperation, and it would become your own. You would need it to be true just as much as they did, because for them, this was their last and only hope. Joshua would float across the crowd. He would be exorcising people's demons. He would be curing people right there, right in front of them. People would be screaming and cheering. There was just like a primal release. The energy was insane. I could only imagine what it was like, the euphoria of the crowd, the screaming, the joy. I mean, it must have been intoxicating. People would really get swept up in all of the euphoria. Ray talked about how you would start to feel like you were part of something bigger than yourself. You would get swept up and you would be excited to take home this experience with you and tell people like, hey, I went to this church. I really felt the Holy Spirit. This is real. This is the real deal. But once you arrived and you started experiencing this, you kind of didn't want to leave. Unbeknownst to them, as soon as they had stepped off that bus, the manipulation had already begun. So higher up members of the organization and the church were kind of scanning the crowd, watching for people who they could tell were really buying into the juju. When they knew they had a vulnerable target, which would oftentimes be young white teenagers, they would approach them with a proposition: become a missionary for the synagogue. They'd say that you'd stay there for a couple of months, you would get to meet TB Joshua, and you could even basically become like him, spread the word, become enlightened. You could maybe even perform miracles one day. Now, there are varying accounts of how exactly you would be approached. According to some, they would approach you and say, hey, do you want to be a missionary? But some people said that TB Joshua himself would come up to you and basically tell you that God sent him a message and told him you are going to stay. But once you agree, you're stuck. They'd unload your bags from the trucks and you'd be moved into permanent housing on site at the church to a place called the compound. No one left the compound. There were armed guards at the gate who were supposedly there for your protection from the outside city. There was a giant wall and blacked out windows. Every concerning thing that the visitors saw, they were told was for their own protection. Immediately, it was drilled into you. You can never leave the compound. For your own safety. Think about it. You're in a foreign country and you've been separated from your church and your friends. And you're being told that this is a safe haven for you. This is kind of protecting you from the outside world. The compound was divided into various parts and the living quarters were separated by gender. In the female dorm, there was a kind of culture of nakedness. Like, nakedness was really, really encouraged. Everyone was kind of family. It's all good. You can be naked. Everyone was known by first names only. Sister Rachel, Sister Carol. But weirdest of all, TB Joshua was referred to as Daddy. You have all your sisters, Joshua's your daddy, and this is your family now. Once they were kind of isolated in the compound, TB Joshua would basically be preaching about how their old families were corrupted and holding them back, and this was their new family now. They needed to kind of isolate themselves from the old world and their old way of life. Slowly but surely, this kind of rhetoric would cause them to willingly kind of cut ties with their families and their loved ones back at home. You weren't allowed to check your email, your passport would be confiscated. This is all kind of classic cult tactics. Joshua would use these young white recruits to sort of legitimize his church and himself to the outside world. From the perspective of the disciples, the world needed TB Joshua and his teachings. They thought that they were helping him spread the word of God. To the disciples, it was their duty to help spread the message of the synagogue. Meanwhile, in reality, he was just using them to further his agenda. And as they would soon find out, he was going to start using them for far more nefarious purposes. To the outside world, the disciples looked happy and polished. They'd have their hair and makeup done and would be picture perfect. But in reality, being a disciple of TB Joshua was absolutely terrifying. According to ex-SCOAN members, you were under incredibly strict rules. You had to stand at attention whenever he entered a room. He was in charge of every little detail of your life and day, from what you wore and read to when you were allowed to pee. If you wanted to use the restroom, you had to stop by his office and ask for permission. The compound created a kind of community built on on paranoia and fear. The bathrooms and showers had cameras in them. There were no clocks, so your sense of time was skewed. Disciples were encouraged to report and snitch on each other in exchange for Joshua's approval. There was no safe space. Amongst the disciples in Joshua, he would hold meetings. I'm not sure if they were weekly or daily, but they were often. And at these meetings, he would publicly humiliate people and force them to kind of beg for his forgiveness. People were snitching on each other, and even if these transgressions were real or made up, it didn't really matter. He was still going to humiliate you. And he would oftentimes record these confessions of you confessing to these things that you did or did not do, and then use them against you later on. Sleep was also a big thing in the compound. Sleep was seen as one of the worst sins you could commit against God. Disciples worked constantly, organizing faith healings, getting the church ready for the next day of visitors, cleaning, writing articles for the church, even building some of the infrastructure for the ever-expanding church. The disciples worked unpaid for hours and hours a day, and if you disobeyed, you would be beaten by him. Joshua apparently had a massive temper, and he would switch up on people at the drop of a hat. And what's crazy is this physical abuse was extremely normalized in the compound. Ray recounts how they were told that it was an honor to be slapped by TB Joshua because he was next to Jesus. People like Joshua oftentimes make you fear them, but at the same time really crave their approval. Like when the relationship is going bad, it's really bad, but when it's good, it's so good, and you want to do anything to please them. Anyways, throughout all of this, Joshua would be preaching for hours upon hours a day, and members of the church, including the disciples, especially the disciples, were encouraged to memorize his words as if they were the word of God. The brainwashing was constant. Now, essentially what Joshua had created was a workforce of unskilled, and that will be important later, unpaid laborers who saw him as a god and were willing to devote their entire lives to him. So he put that workforce to good use. The SCOAN Cathedral was built entirely by foreign visitors who thought that they were taking part in like a fun, amazing, charitable kind of cause, and disciples who were working for no money and running on no sleep. And the money that was coming into the church, donations and gifts and money that he would receive from appearances and faith healings, was all going to Joshua. Speaking of healings, at least he still had that going for him, right? He might be a nightmare to live with and physically abusive, but at least he's still curing people of their HIV and helping blind people see, right? Yeah, no, all the miracles on the VHS tapes were absolutely faked. There was a super complex system actually that went into creating these fake miracles. So basically, people that wanted to be healed would be put into a line based on their ailments. People with cancer would be rounded up and actually sent away, but people who had physical wounds or emergency issues, things that you could really see, they would be approved, and then their ailments would be presented as if they had cancer. They'd be given medicine, and then the clips that showed their before and after results were oftentimes filmed weeks, months, even a year apart, and then edited together to make them look like it was the same day. Boom. For the live testimonies, people who were sick would be encouraged to really exaggerate. TB Joshua isn't going to pray for you unless you really show him that you need it. These poor, desperate people were being manipulated. Then the people with the really big issues like the HIV, the liver disease, the cancer, stuff like that, Joshua would pray for them and then encourage them to not take their medication. Ray herself, when she was still part of the organization, was quoted as saying, "We are not the healer, God is the healer. There's never a sickness God cannot heal, never a disease God cannot cure, never a burden God cannot bear, never a problem God cannot solve. To his power, nothing is impossible. We have not done anything to bring about healing, deliverance, or prosperity. If somebody is healed, it is God who heals." This is all incredibly tragic to me because people actually died because they believed in this man. They stopped taking their medication because he told them not to. It's really difficult for ex-members to justify this large-scale deception, but Joshua framed it in a way that made them seem like all of this was extremely necessary. You're building people's faith in God and in Christ, so it's justified. They really thought that they were doing the right thing. All of this is to say that being a disciple of Joshua was incredibly hard work. but being a female disciple was particularly difficult. So remember the compound? Well, at the top of the compound, Joshua actually resided in a place known as the apartment. Now, at this time, Joshua was actually married. Yes, he was married to a woman named Evelyn who lived in a different apartment. She didn't live with him. Huge red flag, by the way. Anyways, his apartment was crafted for the sole purpose of keeping secrets. Multiple doors, secret staircases and entryways so people wouldn't see you, and doors that lock from the outside. Joshua had a particular affinity for his young female disciples, and how he went about using his untethered influence to abuse them was absolutely disgusting. According to victims, the advances would start almost immediately after their discipleship had begun. Multiple women go into detail about their absolutely harrowing ordeal in this BBC documentary, but essentially girls would be woken up by a dorm mother or the senior church member in the middle of the night and told, "Daddy is calling you, go to his room immediately and bring your Bible." They're probably wondering, did I do something wrong? Is he upset? But they would go. Girls were led through secret staircases up to a hidden entrance to Joshua's apartment. Once inside, Joshua would confirm that no one saw them. He would ask, did anyone see you? Secrecy was always at the top of his list of priorities. Once he had confirmed that they hadn't been seen, he would sit them down and tell them just what a good job that they were doing as a disciple and how special they were to him. He would tell them that God had told him himself that they were such a blessing to him and the church. Once he had kind of disarmed them, they would be told to strip naked, lie on his bed, and he would assault them. Unfortunately, this was the story of countless women and girls who walked up that dimly lit staircase up to Joshua's room. The man who they had looked up to and sought spiritual guidance from, the man who they saw as a father figure and protector, had become their biggest tormentor. And oftentimes they were too petrified, whether it was fear or shame or whatever, to tell anyone. And unfortunately, the torment didn't stop after these late night sessions. Jessica, a South African disciple of Joshua, had actually started coming to the church around the age of 16. She recounts that over the years she was sexually abused constantly, and she was made to have many forced abortions just to keep things quiet. In order to maintain ultimate secrecy, abortions began to take place in the quote-unquote medical department of the synagogue, a portion of the church that was unknown to the public. That's how many women were being forcibly impregnated in the compound, that he had to devote an entire secret wing of his church to abortions. And safety wasn't necessarily the priority with these abortions. According to Bisola, one of the higher ranking members of Joshua's inner circle, some of these girls would almost die from complications from these backdoor procedures. Girls and young women were being relentlessly abused and unable to turn to anyone for help. But no one saw as much hostility as his most despised follower, Ajoke. Ajoke was born in Nigeria in 1996, and according to her, she had a very happy childhood. She never knew her birth mother, but she was raised by her affluent biological father and stepmother. Everything was fine until one day, when she was just about 7 years old, she was suspended from school for a misdemeanor. This would have been bad enough for any kid, but it was especially bad because TB Joshua was her father. Ajoke was actually TB Joshua's illegitimate daughter, and a result of a secret affair. Some believe it was with one of his congregants, but there's no confirmation on that. A local journalist actually caught wind of her suspension and wrote an article about TB Joshua's alleged illegitimate daughter getting suspended from school, which is like so crazy, but yeah, they wrote about it and he kind of really overreacted. Joshua panicked, immediately took her out of school, and forced her to start living on the compound. Now, Ajoke didn't exactly adjust well to her life at the compound. The insane sleeping schedule and rigorous lifestyle, the totalitarian rule of her dad, it was all just too much for her. Now, keep in mind, she's only a child at this point. She's only 7 years old, but she was labeled as a rebel. Her rebellious attitude was seen as evil and a sign of her sinful predisposition. It wasn't long before the physical abuse began. Ajoke began to represent a mistake, a threat to Joshua's squeaky clean, curated image that he had worked so long to craft. He hated her and never let her forget it. She was oftentimes the target of his fits of rage, receiving unprovoked beatings in front of the disciples. He even encouraged the other disciples to physically attack her because she was nothing. According to him, she was less than nothing, a devil child, an evil person. This abuse went on for years and years. Ray is quoted as saying, "Another disciple took her to the shower and whipped her with an electrical cord and then turned the hot water on." Ajoke says, "I was screaming at the top of my voice and they just let the water run on my head for a very long time." Eventually, after being a witness to and the target of her father's vitriol for so many years, Ajoke snapped. She couldn't take it anymore. One day she went into the office when he was in a meeting with his inner circle and she just exploded. She screamed at her father and started to demand answers. Why was he abusing the girls and women that he claimed to love? Why was he sleeping with them and manipulating them? The entire room fell silent, including Joshua. I mean, he was absolutely shocked. And for a second, it seemed like maybe Ajoke had said something that had actually gotten through to him. But sadly, all this had done was made him extremely angry. He started to violently beat her while proclaiming his own innocence, and pretty soon, everyone else present started to beat her as well. But even throughout all of this, getting kicked and slapped and punched, she would not stop yelling. She just kept screaming, "I know what you're doing. I know what you've done. I know that you've been abusing these girls." For this stunt, Ajoke was forced into isolation, and she stayed there for months. In isolation, she was beaten with chains daily and hardly given any food. Meanwhile, Joshua was on the offensive, spreading lies about her, his own daughter, attempting to discredit her. I'm sure he was absolutely shook that someone would dare to confront him and stand up to him, and it's not just like some random person, it's his own daughter, who he just absolutely hated. But this little shakeup was just the beginning, because pretty soon all that TB Joshua had built up was about to collapse. So fast forward to 2014, September 12th, 2014 to be exact. By this point, Joshua's influence and reputation had reached an all-time high. He was known around the world. He had officially made it. SCOAN had branches in Ghana, the UK, and South Africa. He had a private jet and luxurious houses. When he would arrive in other countries, he would have police escorts, and thousands of people would gather at the airport cheering for him. He knew presidents, politicians, dignitaries. Joshua had built an empire, and it was growing by the day. At this point, he also had a 24-hour broadcast network called Emmanuel TV that showed his sermons on repeat, on loop, 24 hours a day across the world. Access to Emmanuel TV was attracting new followers from around the globe at an exponential rate. People were visiting SCOAN at record high numbers, and pretty soon Joshua was thinking that he would need to kind of expand the compound to accommodate all of these people that were coming and staying. He kind of figured that all of these foreign visitors, especially people from the US and the UK, were shelling out big bucks to stay in nice hotels. Why not just cut out the middleman, have them stay on campus, and charge them basically the same amount of money? And these aren't just people that are coming to watch him. A lot of these people are coming to be healed. So they'd be willing to pay these exorbitant fees, not just to get to Nigeria, but to stay at the guest house, just so they could see this man. The guest house turned out to be a huge success. People really enjoyed staying there. It was bringing in great revenue for the church. But on September 12th, 2014, at about 1 p.m., everything changed. Now, remember how I said that Joshua had basically created a workforce of unskilled, unpaid laborers? Well, he had basically used his disciples and the foreign visitors who would come and volunteer and help him build stuff to construct the guest house. That was not a good idea, because on that fateful day, the guest house collapsed. Most of the foreign visitors, mainly hailing from South Africa, were staying at the guest house, so the building was full when the structure collapsed. This terrible tragedy would later be described as one of the worst disasters in Nigerian history. The collapse of the guest house caused major panic, not only for people on the property, but also abroad. Families of those who had traveled to the synagogue were frantically trying to get into contact with their loved ones visiting. After the dust had settled, the death toll was 116, and people wanted answers. According to the BBC documentary, on September 12th, just 2 hours before the building collapse, a maintenance worker stopped by to perform some usual routine maintenance, and he realized the foundation of the building wasn't sound. at all. The building was shaky and unstable. Immediately, the maintenance worker was told to keep quiet about what he had noticed. This makes me wonder just how long did they know about the issues and decided to do nothing about it. Higher up members of the church and Joshua himself knew the structure wasn't sound, and if they hadn't neglected to fix it, 116 people would still have their lives. Now, this is all alleged, but apparently the reason the guest house was so unstable in the first place was because Joshua kept on insisting that it be built higher and higher and higher. The foundation was never meant to support a structure of that size. Joshua had spent his entire career painstakingly crafting the perfect image of the happy-go-lucky, charming pastor. He had managed to sidestep allegations, sweep rumors of exploitation and embezzlement under the rug, and mold every narrative in his favor. But a cover-up of this magnitude was not going to be so easily orchestrated. He immediately got to work on damage control. The official explanation from SCOAN was that an unspecified entity was trying to bomb the church in an attempt to kill TB Joshua, but that had failed. Of course, he spun it around and made himself the victim. Michaela, a member of SCOAN who happened to be in South Africa at the time, was instructed to visit the families of the deceased, give them money in exchange for their silence. Many people took the money, but some refused. Why would Joshua try to buy their silence if he had nothing to hide? The collapse was caused by a bomb or a UFO or whatever, right? Joshua had nothing to do with it, right? While disciples were sent out to manage damage control abroad, people back in Lagos were doing their best to try to manage the media response. At the scene, rows upon rows of media trucks and news trucks, reporters and such had kind of gathered around and were trying to see just how bad this disaster actually was. Paramedics and volunteers started going into the rubble and tried to pull out as many survivors as they could. And a crowd had kind of gathered around and, people were cheering. They were pulling people out. People were getting saved. And it seemed like for a while, miraculously, there weren't that many casualties. Then at about 9 p.m., the press was ordered off the property and the reality of the situation crept in. Unbeknownst to the public, there had been a completely separate operation. While a few survivors were being flaunted in front of the press and taken to the hospital, the majority who hadn't survived were being kept hidden, away from the cameras. And there were a lot of bodies, but the true magnitude of the tragedy wasn't being reported. Their corpses were put into body bags by church members, placed into church vans, and hauled off. To this day, no one really knows where the bodies are buried or what the true death toll is. Like, these are people who flew thousands of miles, spent so much money just to see you. You just haul them away in the dark of the night, don't even give them a proper burial. It's really just, it's disgusting and it's sad. According to some eyewitnesses, Joshua wasn't even there on that first day after the collapse. He initially was just giving orders to people from his apartment. He just wanted to make it all go away, with some hush money and some outlandish story about bombings. I think at this point, this was a real wake-up call for a lot of the disciples. The way that he handled the situation was so brazenly disrespectful. An independent inspection of the site showed that there was, of course, no bombing, and the building collapse was due to structural failure. Again, this was a real reality check. A lot of disciples started to feel like, okay, maybe it's time to get out. And this is after years and years and years. Like, some of these disciples had been with Joshua for 10, 12, 15 years at this point, living in the compound, hanging on to his every word, instruction. This is after a decade plus of no sleep, physical, mental, psychological abuse, sexual assaults, and so on. And I really can't even imagine the fear that must have been going through some of their minds. Like, this was their entire life for over a decade. And now the blindfold was like all of a sudden being lifted off of their eyes. A lot of them felt like there was absolutely no middle ground. You were either with SCOAN and you were going to heaven, or you were not a part of the church and you were going to hell. This idea of black and white, heaven or hell, all of this stuff had been drilled into their mind for a decade. But somehow they just knew they could not stay anymore. After the building collapsed, murmurs began to fill the corridor of the compound. Decade-long female disciples began to finally open up about the years of abuse, and pretty soon, everyone started to realize that they were not alone in their suffering and pain. One victim, Annika, who'd been one of Joshua's disciples for over 5 years at that point, had reached her breaking point after a particularly brutal assault from him. She finally decided to open up to another female member and tell her what had been happening. To her shock, she realized that it wasn't just her who was experiencing the abuse. After years of keeping quiet, years of being told this abuse you're enduring is for your own good, your own salvation, and that you're special because of it, Annika decided that she was going to return home to the UK, and this time she wasn't coming back. Now, this interview with Annika was something that I watched in the BBC documentary, and she mentioned this idea of coming back. At this point, a lot of the disciples were doing missionary work where they would be able to leave and preach Joshua's teachings and such, kind of recruit more people, and I think a lot of them were being sent up to the UK and places like that. Many of them were going back to their home countries and then, of course, were expected to return to Lagos. Whether or not they were given free rein when they were abroad and they were just so brainwashed at that point that they didn't think that they could reach back out to their families and go home is kind of unclear. But from what I'm piecing together, I think that they were doing missionary work, but many of them just felt like they had nowhere else to go, or that they were still being called by Joshua. They needed to stay as part of members of SCOAN, so they would return. But all I know is that Annika was like, I'm done, I'm leaving, I'm going back to the UK, and I'm not coming back. Now, I know for some people, this might be an opportunity to question the extent of the abuse. You know, if they could fly home at any point, why didn't they just escape when they had the chance? But this is the power of a cult. They cut you off from your family, your friends. They take your money. They completely destroy your sense of autonomy. It isn't just about physical barriers like having tall walls and armed guards outside. Joshua had a psychological hold on his victims that many of them felt was impossible to break. And once you did manage to break free, the escape would have to be done by you and you alone. If you were caught, you would be severely punished. Despite all of this, people slowly started to leave. Some of them under the ruse of doing missionary work in other countries, others just escaped in the dead of night. But once they were in the borders of other countries or outside of the walls of the compound, they made it clear that they were not coming back and they were officially defecting. Two of Joshua's closest disciples, Agamo Paul and Bisola, had essentially defected and attempted to raise the alarm bells about what was going on at the synagogue. Paul wrote a 13-page petition to give to authorities that documented all of the abuse he had witnessed. But the police did nothing. A lot of the local police were members of the church, and if they weren't, he was paying them off. Paul and Bisola then decided, let's make a video and post it online. In the video, they both shared hellish experiences that they had endured and harrowing details of what it was like being a disciple of Joshua. They tried to warn people of what a hypocritical and dangerous individual he was. In retaliation, Joshua launched a smear campaign. He used footage of their taped confessions of their sins, their traumas, their shortcomings, many of which were recorded under duress. These confessions were oftentimes of every lie they ever told, every single sin they'd ever committed. Real or made up, it didn't really matter. It was all on tape. And he used this to discredit and humiliate them. These videos spread all over the internet. Some of them were posted to YouTube apparently, and they kind of served as a warning to the other disciples of, look what happens if you try to go against me. I will use your deepest, darkest secrets and I will expose them to the world. But a little YouTube smear campaign was not enough for Joshua. He wanted more. He really wanted to send a message. Bisola started to notice that people were tracking her and following her, and one day she was actually attacked outside of her home. 3 men had kind of gathered outside of her door, and when she opened it, she was attacked and beaten viciously. After this, she continued to be followed and tracked. People were coming up to her in the streets and threatening her. It was terrible. She had to start wearing disguises just so she could go out and buy food and just live her life. It actually got so bad that she eventually had to move and leave her house. And when they found her again, she decided to leave the country. But somehow they always managed to find her. I cannot even imagine what it's like to basically be stalked and attacked no matter where you go, just because You left a church and you're trying to warn people like, hey, what's going on here is abusive and messed up, and now you have to pay for it for the rest of your life. It's terrible. So things clearly started to unravel for Joshua during this mass exodus, and his grip on the disciples was clearly not as tight as it used to be. One of the people who was luckily able to escape during this time was Ajuke, Joshua's horrifically treated daughter. But unlike many of the disciples who had homes waiting for them back in their native countries, Ajuke had no one and nowhere to go to. She was homeless and penniless and had to survive on the streets of Lagos on her own. Eventually, she landed on her feet, but what she had to endure, both in the compound and on the streets of Lagos, was insanely difficult. Ray ended up resigning from her position on May 26, 2013, almost 15 years after joining SCOAN. After coming there to be cured of her homosexuality and realizing that this false prophet could do nothing for her but cause her pain, misery, and abuse, she finally gathered the strength to leave and never come back. Eventually, it became clear. The exodus of Joshua's most dedicated disciples, along with the guest house disaster and numerous allegations of sexual assault, were just too much to ignore. Joshua finally had to face justice for his crimes, and he was eventually sentenced to 50 years in prison. Just kidding, wouldn't that be great? No, no. Yeah, Joshua never had to pay for his crimes. He never saw the inside of a jail cell. He never even saw a day in court. In fact, around this time, his global reach had reached a fever pitch. He was selling out stadiums and going on worldwide tours. His 2014 Miracle Crusade in Colombia was allegedly attended by over 100,000 people. In May of 2015, his sermons at the Estadio Azteca was attended by almost 200,000 people. He was untouchable. He used his immense wealth, his position in the global Christian community, his many political connections, and ties with local law enforcement to keep himself afloat and escape justice. He couldn't escape death, though. On June 5th, 2021, TB Joshua died at the age of 57. His funeral is attended by thousands upon thousands, and it was broadcast live on Emmanuel TV, so it could be viewed by hundreds of thousands across the globe. On January 31st of 2024, just a few days after the BBC documentary was released on YouTube, TB Joshua's YouTube channel was actually deleted for violating YouTube's hate speech policy. So his YouTube channel faced more punishment than he ever did. No, Joshua never apologized for the abuse he inflicted on his victims. TB Joshua's wife is now the leader of the Synagogue Church of All Nations, and SCOAN still has over 50,000 members in Nigeria, and millions of people tune in abroad to watch Emmanuel TV. The BBC documentary, which I cited heavily in this video, did so much to shed light on these horrible crimes and gave a platform for the victims who were silent for so long. But it also received a ton of criticism from devotees of Joshua. Just a quick scroll in the comments of the video show hundreds upon hundreds of people pledging their support to Joshua, even after the allegations and after his death. People are still devoted and are defending this man, and it's crazy. Since Joshua's death, his influence has continued to grow. Not only has his church maintained its dominance within the televangelism scene, but his style, teachings, and business model have inspired numerous ministries led by former disciples who continue to perpetuate and propagate his harmful rhetoric and practices. That's right, he's got minions. One such former disciple is John Chi, a Cameroonian pastor who left SCOAN in 2013. Chi founded the Ark of God's Covenant Ministry in Cameroon. In Chi's live streams and sermons, the influence of Joshua is clear. Taking another page out of the megalomaniac minister playbook, Chi also created his own satellite channel, Ark of God TV, where you can enjoy miracles, preachings, and church services 24 hours a day, every day. Chi's YouTube channel has amassed over 50 million views, and the Ark of God ministry has apps where his devotees can receive messages and witness miracles in real time. Chi is just one example of many who have learned and broken away from TB Joshua to replicate his unprecedented success, both back home in Nigeria and abroad. The danger in this is that they are also replicating a harmful and predatory brand of spiritualism. On Chi's YouTube channel, you can find misinformation about illnesses like cancer, HIV, AIDS, and other STDs. Ark of God TV indulges in and amplifies conspiracy theories about the Illuminati, lizard people, and mermaids. They have videos claiming that they can resurrect dead babies and provide the secrets to healing broken bones. Chi is remarkably vocal about his admiration of the late Joshua. Quote, "If not for my mentor, Prophet TB Joshua, I would not be what I am today. Without Prophet TB Joshua, you would not have heard about the Apostle John Chi." In a video on his YouTube channel, Chi responds to the allegations made in the documentary by referring to the victims as blackmailers, liars, and jobless people. Quote, "If you had a job, you wouldn't be after someone who is not alive to defend himself." Sick burn, John. Wow. So that is the story of TB Joshua and the Synagogue Church of all nations. This story was honestly such a roller coaster to research. It was really fascinating to see how people can use religion and media to manipulate people for their own selfish purposes. Now, it's undeniable to say that TB Joshua was not an incredibly influential man. He was a guiding light for thousands upon thousands of people. But to only look at the positive things he's done and just completely ignore the pain and suffering and abuse that he caused is just ridiculous to me. He conned people out of thousands of dollars, and he took the most susceptible and vulnerable people who looked up to him and morphed them into his most devoted disciples just to turn around and abuse them. It's horrifying and it's shameful, and it's just unfortunate that he got away with it for so long. My heart goes out to all of the victims, and I'm happy that they were able to regain some sort of semblance, hopefully, of control and relief by finally being able to speak out about all of this. But thank you so much for making it to the end of the video. If you enjoyed this content, please like and subscribe. I will be posting more videos like this in the future. And please leave a comment on what you think about this whole controversy, about Joshua's legacy, and about this story in general. I'm going to be putting out more African true crime videos on this channel, hopefully every single month. So again, thank you so much for watching.